So welcome to Lacea session, the future of work in Latin America. We have three papers on what's the way that industrialization and automation, etc., will impact Latin American countries. And so the first presenter will be Pablo Egana-del Sol, who will have the floor now.
Thank you, Jeanne, for the introduction. So can you see it correctly? Cool. So hello, everyone.
Yes.
First, I would like to thank the organizer, in particular, Jeanne Lafortune, our chair, for considering our paper for the session. And we would like also to thank Joseba Martinez for taking the time to discuss our work in this time, which is very hard to find kind of time to do research and stuff. So I really appreciate your generosity, Joseba. Today, we will talk about the future of work in developing economies. This is a joint work with Alejandro Mico, and the focus of the presentation will be about what can we learn and how can we characterize a little bit better the future of work on developing countries. We will also show data for developed countries to make the result more comparable and meaningful. And we made in the last couple of weeks a substantial effort to present today's results more concrete in terms of salaries and employment compared to the submitted version a couple of months ago. So we're trying to make this as compelling as possible. This is the first time that we present this paper, so all the comments to make it better and more interesting are more than welcome. So the agenda, first, we're gonna do a brief motivation and kind of to highlight why it's important to study and the future of work in this context, and also to kind of shed lights on possible hypotheses on the results. Then we're going to describe the data, the empirical framework. We are not having a identify empirical strategy today, so please don't be mad on us. It's more predictive. We are characterizing something, and we are planning to move forward in the future on that direction. But you will see that the effort is put to try to have a larger sample of countries and trying to get that as a first step, and hopefully in the future, and we have been doing in other work to have a more identified results. And then we're going to present the results and draw some conclusions. So studies aiming to estimate the impact of automation have been predict that on average between 5% and 45% of jobs in developed countries are at high risk of automation in the next 20 years. This will depend on the empirical strategy and also on the kind of conceptual model that the authors follow. So we have on one side David Autor and colleagues. They focus in a task-based approach, and we have on the other side Frey and Osborne, who have been doing an occupation-based approach. We're going to try today to put both to see if they are kind of consistent for this context. The evidence relative to developing economies is scant and country specific. So we have a working paper in Indonesia wrote by Kali and Presidente the past 2 years. And we also have a recent paper that we published with Gabriel Cruz and Alejandro Mico on the case of Chile. In that case, we used the COVID economic crisis as an external shock to try to identify better the results. But in general, we don't find that many evidence on developing economies, at least to the best on our knowledge. And recent research is looking at new occupation or responses to automation from workers in developed countries as well. This is the work of authors Salomons and Sig Miller, a recent NBR working paper, and Dauth et al. Is published in the Technological Forecasting and Social Change on the case of Germany. So how developing nations differ, or in which kind of dimension we will care to look at and think why the story is going to be different in this context. So some relevant characteristics, just to name a few. In developing countries, we have higher cost of capital, we have smaller capital labor ratio, or lesser capital deepening, how it's called in the literature, lesser educated workers, higher informality, higher levels of inequality, lower salaries, lower labor force participation, especially for women, weaker social safety net, etc. So we have a lot of characteristics that are related somehow to the future of work, to if this automation process are gonna take off at some point in developing countries, and how the prediction could change in function of these different characteristics. There is also this evidence from the World Bank, from the Digital Divide Dividend report. They say that developing countries are potentially decades behind developed world in technology adoption. So the analysis today, we want to try to, at the beginning, do some predictions, and then we're going to try to compare with developed countries as a way to argue that we're still kind of behind, and we're going to try to use that as a sort of comparison, or I will not talk about different for identification, but a sort of comparison, I would say, in our results. And there's also like a secular downward trend in the technology capital prices, so that they are going down fast. And there is also recent evidence that COVID-19 pandemic has been accelerating technology adoption in developing countries. We have this work with Alejandro that I just mentioned, and there is this paper in Ristat by Haimovich and Siu that they show that economic crisis stimulate the technology adoption. So we based our analysis on that idea, and then we kind of trying to use COVID as a case. We also have a draft now for the US, if you are interested, using the same kind of idea. We also have that automation of work make highly educated workers more productive. It's kind of obvious, and less educated work is easier to replace with machinery. It's a typical result from author. And contrary to the US, there is no evidence on polarization on developing economies, right? As Maloney, who is here with Carlos Molina, wrote a couple of years ago. And today we're going to learn what's going to happen, right, in Latin America from the paper of Jeanne and Alex and co-authors. What kind of things around automation are different, right? So here we have in the first line we have developing country, and the second developed, and we observe, of course, the GDP. That's kind of the definition, right? It's smaller for developing. The imports of ICT goods are also like fivefold smaller. The imports of ICT services are actually smaller. Robots per worker are almost tenfold smaller for developing than for developed countries, and the World Bank has these digital business indexes, right? We're trying to for business, right? We're trying to kind of put many dimensions on how digitalize our business in general in countries, and the index is almost half for developing world. So we are in this world that we can argue that developed country had experienced large investment in ICT or technology capital in general in the past, and for the same reason, crisis and all these shocks would facilitate the transition, right? This technological change, if you want to call it, in the labor market in developed world compared to developing world. So that's the way that we're gonna compare, right? So in short, what we're going to argue, what's our hypothesis here? First, we have like this idea that automation in developing economies has larger potential, right? So we're going to do some prediction, like, oh, this is kind of according to these characteristics of the labor force, education, age, the task, if they perform more routine or non-routine or interpersonal or more sophisticated task compared to developing countries will affect differently that prediction. So the first going to be more like a predictive exercise. I'm going to try to characterize that as best as we can. And second, we're going to try to look, because the interesting thing at the end of the day, we want to see how this will affect employment, right? How this will affect salaries, how it will affect labor share. So we're trying to move in that direction. It was very hard to get data on this, right? So we have individualized data. I want to show you. We harmonize a lot of countries, but it's very hard at the end of the day to have that kind of data. We're trying to work with the IPUM's data that Bill Maloney had worked, but it was we had very bad data, I would say. So hope at the end, Bill, you can help us to figure out how to kind of improve that endeavor. So we end up using occupation level from UNIDO data to try to proxy employment and employment growth, which is kind of more interesting to look. So we will expect that developing countries should exhibit a reduction in their employment rate and salary in occupation with higher automation risk, which is in line of the result from the US from, for example, Acemoglu and Restrepo, etc. And third, which is kind of the many of the analyses that I want to show today are related to this, we will find that developed countries should experience a larger reduction in their employment and salaries in occupation with higher automation risk compared to developed countries, because they have this larger investment already in technology capital, so they can kind of like move in that direction faster. So we will follow three approaches in the paper. So first, we try to sketch a theoretical model, which is based on SEIRA, and is the same one that author and Acemoglu and Restrepo has been using to try to see and explore how developing countries are different theoretically, right? Which kind of parameters are different? Elasticity of substitution could be different. The capital to output ratio could be different. So we are trying to kind of think about how we can kind of consider some predictions based on a theoretical exercise, not considered today. The second, we conduct empirical analysis in order to identify the most relevant tasks, skills, and demographics to cope with the risk of automation in developing economies. This could help a lot for example, public policy around this in terms of like how we can reskill, which kind of areas are more relevant or correlates negatively with risk of automation, which areas correlate positively, etc. And third, we estimate the relationship of automation risk on wages and employment on developing countries vis-a-vis developed ones. So that's the idea, to trying to explore if the effects it's larger in developed countries because they have more ICT capital already, and that somehow will shed light the direction that we should expect that developed countries will move in the future. So data, we collected data from the following part. So first was the STEP, so it's the World Bank Skill Measurement Programs. It's a household survey to workers, and we have 10 countries. It's a very rich data sets that we have been using in other projects as well. Very underexploited data set, I would say. It's very hard to get identification. I think that's the problematic thing. And we are trying to put that data with surveys that are local per country, but it's still a work in progress. And then we're going to have the PUC, the OECD program for international assessment of adult competencies, where we have 36 countries. A couple of them are still considered developing for our purposes, like Chile, Turkey, Peru, I think is over there, and other countries. And then for the employment data, we are using the UNIDO dataset for manufacturing industry at 2 digits. And we use the same subsample of PUC just to have consistency on the kind of countries that we are considering. So this is the list of countries. So in the step, we have Armenia, Bolivia, China, Colombia, Georgia, Ghana, Kenya, Laos, Macedonia, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, and Vietnam. We didn't consider Georgia and Ukraine because of the data. Even the World Bank in their analysis, they don't use that data. We got kind of informally data from Colombia and also from El Salvador, which we're not considering yet here, but we are planning to incorporate that in the future. And then for the PUC UNIDO, we have all the set of countries. So we have considerably more developed ones, but we have some that we can consider developing, like Chile, Ecuador, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Mexico, etc. So yeah, the empirical framework. Here we're going to explain a little bit the empirical framework on the wage and employment estimation. I will skip the empirical estimation on the predictions, which is basically a profit. They're going to show some results later. But here basically we have the wage at the individual level from the PUC and the STEP dataset. We use a wage percentile at the country level, and we use this variable because it's available at most countries. We also run some as a robustness, some log hourly wage as dependent variable, but was a smaller sample of country, but works similarly, I think. And then the risk is the risk of automation, and this risk is standardized to have mean 0 and standard deviation 1, and we have some sort of fixed effects like country, sector, education, age, gender, among others. Risk, we have both the risk of automation from Frey and Osborne that they use in their paper, and we also have the routine, non-routine classification from author, and I would say like both results were almost similar, right? So I have both tables if you want to see it at the end, but we're going to present mostly the author ones, and then well, they're kind of consistent with the others, so it's not a big deal. And then employment, we have same sort of specification. Employment is defined as the share of employment in a defined synthetic group. Yeah, this was needed to kind of merge the data. Okay, we don't have this data at individual level, so we need to figure out how to merge it. So we did it at occupation level. So we did country, sector, and occupation, and we create these synthetic groups. Right, and then we also trying to do country, gender, and occupation just to have to try to express what was some different in gender and to improve the granularity over there. Here we have employment growth. So we basically this the delta, right, of the log of employment, and this is a typical growth equation. We use the period 2000-2014 because that's the period that there's an acceleration on automation according to this recent finding from Jaimovic and Siu. We could also consider from the 90s to 2014, and the results were kind of the same. So we are considering this period, so we have more kind of variance in employment related to occupation at risk of automation. And employment growth, the annual employment growth at 2-digit ESIC review 3.1 at country levels and country sector levels. So, and we use as instrument the lag, right? We instrument the lag with the lag in 2 periods behind, and just to and I think the results are consistent with that. So the results first, we have this risk. So we basically have all the workers in these 10 countries from the STEP dataset. We are able to assign to each worker the predicted kind of likelihood to be automated, which is the column on here. The first one, for example, this is using the author, and the third column is using the Frey and Osborne risk. And that's kind of the predicted value. If you add all your skills and all the tasks and your demographics, that's the predicted value like that you have as a worker in these countries. And then, which a metric that's very used in the literature, they try to transform this to the workers, they call the share of workers at high risk. So you're trying to see, okay, among all the workers of the country, how many, what's the fraction, right, that they have a predicted risk of automation, which is above 70%, right? So you took all the one that's above 70%, you put a 1, and then you divide for the total, right? And that's a metric that maybe is more meaningful for public policy or to figure out like, oh, there's like so many people. For example, if we consider the Frey and Osborne one, we have like 42% in Ghana and 43% in Sri Lanka of workers that their predicted value given what they do at work is above 70%. But then you have China, for example, which is just 8, or Armenia, which is 7, which is not too bad, right? Then, So then if you just sort this data by education level, experience, or age, they're all increasing monotonically on this variable, which makes a lot of sense. You have if you are more educated, you have more experience, or you are older, your value of the automation, the predicted value decrease, right? So that's kind of you can think as a sort of insurance, right? If you talk with AI especially, they will say that it's an insurance in the short term, right? Because many of the professionals, right, they have a lot of years of education. They may also kind of face a threat on what they do, but most likely they will change the nature of what they do and not the whole occupation, right? But it's consistent with results for developed countries. And if we compare our results with the OECD, the developed nation on the OECD, we have that the OECD, the range was from 6% to 12% among the high risk, the share of worker under high risk. The median was 9%, and in developing nation, we have the range was kind of shift a little bit to the left, and we also with a way long side on the right? So we have like between 8% and 42% is the range, and the median is 23%. So it's more than the double compared to the OECD country, which is slightly similar to the overall automation predicted value. So then kind of like the first argument that we wanted to make today is like, okay, if we want to predict this, we may think, look, this is going to be more troublesome for developing economies. Now, if we want to kind of try to understand a little bit better which kind of skill or task at work correlates differently with this risk of automation, we have this table. We have this analysis for all the countries in the sample. I want to just show you the full sample to make it more schematic. But here you have different tasks and skills at work. You have reading, you have writing, numeracy, interpersonal skills, autonomy at work score, physical work, and frequency of thinking and learning new things, which could be kind of some sort of proxy of creativity. And here we have low, medium, and high, which means like how frequent you use this at work, right? So high will be that you read a lot, or you do a lot of physical work, or you are thinking new things and doing new things at work very frequently, right? And this is the results here are very consistent with what you would expect, and what the literature actually shows for the OECD country. This is an OECD report using the same kind of comparison, and the results are fairly consistent with that. So basically, if you have to read or write, or you have to do a lot of interpersonal interactions, or a lot of creative kind of task, the correlation with that with your automation risks is negative, right? So the probability of like being replaced by machine, if you want, are smaller, right? On the contrary, if you do physical work, that will increase your likelihood to be automated. Okay, so these results are super consistent with what you had been seeing for developed countries. So this is just the summary of the result, and this is consistent, as I say, from the work of Arns et al. From the OECD countries. Let me see if I have, okay, I have 5 minutes. And this is, again, the summary for that. Now we move to this more occupation-based estimation to go into wages. Yeah, we have wages. And we want to see how wages will kind of change in function of if the occupation have higher or lower risk of automation. So we have here that we care here in the interaction term, the second line here. So it's risk of automation interacted with develop, and this is negative, right? So which we are negative and close to 0.16, if you want, percentage point. And here what we see is like, okay, the wages will decrease if the same occupation you have an increase on the automation risk. If that occupation is in a developed country, the wage will decrease more, right? So we have that effect that's more pronounced in developed countries than in developing, and this is consistent. We kind of try to kind of confirm or be consistent with our ideas. And that's the reason why we put here ICT skills, which the effect is positive, right? So we may think that ICT skill is positive related with wages, especially in occupation, that when in occupation that has high risk of automation, that will of course be a case for a skill that's valuable in those occupations. So you may think that you will not observe declining wages on those occupations, and you will observe in the other ones. And here at the end, so we also have here the different in the column 3 and 4. We separate developed and emerging countries, and we clearly observe that the impact is larger for developed, right? It's 0.6, and for emerging is 0.4. Right, so that's kind of another way to see that this. And the other one that's important here is to see if there is if gender could be also a dimension. And we observe that women in developed countries are more affected than women in developing countries if they are in occupation with higher risk of automation. So this is kind of the first set of results, which are consistent with this idea that we have experienced a capital deepening in developed countries, so they have more capital, and you will observe that those occupations that have high risk of automation, they have already the technology, so you will observe a decline in wages, which is consistent with the paper in the JPE of Acemoglu and Restrepo, where they show that there is a decline, right, in labor share, salaries, and employment for they use robots, but it's kind of similar. So for automation risk. Here we move to the share of employment. So here we also again care about the second line, which is the interaction between risk of automation and developed, and it's again negative. So employment will fall a little bit more in developed countries if you increase the risk of automation on that occupation. Okay, I think I have 1 minute left. This is kind of similar here. We just changed the synthetic group. So we consider gender, and we're trying to explore gender. And again, the interaction between risk of automation and gender is negative. So we have that if we have an increase of, say, 1 standard deviation in the risk of automation, gender employment will fall by 0.009 percentage point. And here, which is very interesting, is that we have this is the growth equation, and here we have if you have a 1 standard deviation more in the risk of automation, the employment growth on average annually will decrease by 1.2 percentage points in developed countries vis-a-vis developing one. So, and we control for country, year, and sector. So for that reason, we are looking at the second column. Yeah, so that's the kind of the summaries, the conclusions. Just to go to the conclusion, we find that the share of workers at high risk of automation was in the range of 7 to 37%, which is significantly larger than the predictions for developed countries, which is like consistent with everyone we think. Reading, writing, interpersonal autonomy, thinking, and learning new things at work negatively correlates with automation risk. And developed countries exhibit a reduction in their salaries in occupation with higher risk of automation. Developed countries experience a larger reduction in their employment and salary in occupation with higher automation risk compared to developing countries. And for example, 1 standard deviation higher in automation risk reduces in 1.2% the annual employment growth in developed countries compared to developed. This effect is huge. So we are kind of like, okay, we got this result. Now we need to figure out if maybe we need to improve our controls or some sort of strategies. But yeah. So these are the main conclusion for today. So thank you once again, and happy to hear what Joseba has to say about what we are trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. And so now the comments by Joseba Martinez.
All right, great. So thanks so much for inviting me to discuss this really interesting paper. Let me dive in. Okay, so it's a very nice paper. It's very expansive. Okay, so the authors do like this really sweeping review of the literature, some very interesting points about how we might think of the theories in the context of the global south. Okay, and so there's this theory, there's this really good empirical work. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to do justice to the whole paper. So I'm going to focus on what I think is, or at least the core of the contribution, okay, which is to produce this set of automation risk scores for jobs and occupations in developing countries. Okay, that's something we didn't really have before. We have some measures for developed countries, so it's interesting to see these measures for developing countries, and I think the results are like really thought-provoking, really compelling. Okay, so what the authors do, they're going to produce these automation risk scores. Okay, so for individual jobs from the STEP database. From there, we can get automation risk scores for occupations and then aggregate those up to these country level indices that Pablo showed us. Okay, and what are their main findings? So in general, developing countries, they find have a higher proportion of jobs at risk of automation. Okay, and one thing that I find very interesting is that there's like a lot of cross-country variation. You saw, I think Pablo did a good job of explaining this, that the range of variation for developing countries is much, much larger than for developed nations. So I think there's a lot of heterogeneity to think about there. Okay, so let me, since Pablo didn't have time to do this, I'm going to show you how these risk measures are constructed. Okay, so this XKI, okay, that's going to be for some individualized job. That individual, let's say, works in occupation O, and there's a set of K characteristics. Okay, so these could be tasks, it could be gender, it could be education, etc. Okay, so this characterizes the worker. And what the procedure is to calculate job level contributions from each of these characteristics to how risky does that make my job, how exposed does this make my job for automation. So I don't know, an XK could be, I'm doing something very repetitive. You might think if I do something very repetitive in my job, that type of task is going to have a high loading. That's going to give me a high propensity to be automated. So the first step is this is kind of a simplified version of what they do, but the first step is to kind of run this regression in which we have this occupation level automation risk. Okay, so this occupation automation risk, they take from, like for example, from a paper by Frey and Osborne. That's a paper which looks at US occupations and does some kind of machine learning stuff to figure out the propensity of automation. Okay, so that's kind of their input there. And on the right-hand side here, we have the data for the developing countries. Okay, so for a bunch of people in these developing countries, we have their XKIs, we know their occupation. So through running these regressions, we can get these estimates of how much each of these characteristics, how strongly my job loads on these characteristics, whether that increases my propensity to be automated away potentially. So once I have those predictions, then for each job, I can produce a score that says how likely is it or how exposed is my job to automation. Okay, I guess this is always a little tricky because you know, you might think if I'm a factory worker in Ghana, indeed the technology is out there that means that my job could be automated. Okay, so there's a lot of potential for it to be automated. Now, whether or not my job is at risk, I suppose that depends on, you know, do the capital markets in Ghana, are they able to finance this machine? Can the machine be imported? Can the factory be changed? Okay, so there's always a little bit of a tension in this work. This isn't only Pablo's work, in general in this work, and thinking about the risk of automation from a purely descriptive perspective, and really what is the actual risk that those jobs will be automated in reality. Okay, so how do they define high automation risk? So that's going to be within a country. What fraction of jobs in that country have a individual automation risk that's higher than 0.7? And then they also construct this alternative measure, which is this kind of average automation risk for the country. Okay, so at the country level, what's the average of this A hat I? So that ends up looking like this for the set of countries. Okay, so unfortunately, it's a small cross section. Okay, it'd be great to have a bunch more countries. There's all this rich variation. There's a lot of interesting things to think about here. Okay, but you can see that even with this small set, Pablo explained this really well, that you know, particularly for this high automation risk, you can see there's this very large range. Okay, so for comparison, this is from the paper that kind of inspired Pablo's work here. The US high automation risk is somewhere like 9%. Okay, so from this perspective, the US, in terms of how high its automation risk is, or what proportion of its jobs have this high risk of being automated, the US would sit somewhere between this Chinese province, Yunnan, and kind of North Macedonia. Okay, so in terms of interpretation, this is one point that's you know, a little bit difficult. So obviously, I don't know much about the employment structure, say, of Yunnan province. I know a little bit more about the employment structure in the US. I can kind of think about what it means for the US to have high, like what are the jobs in the US that have high automation risk. I think in general, one thing that would be great is that the authors could make a little bit more of this data, try and relate it a little bit more to you know, what might be driving this super rich cross-sectional heterogeneity. To be fair, you know, they do a lot in this paper already. Okay, so this might be something for follow-up work. Okay, so I was curious, so I did a little bit of kind of digging in. So I'm just going to show you some scatter plots. Okay, so small cross-section, but you know, we're all friends here, so you'll forgive me as I interpret these cross-sectional plots. Okay, so the first one here, I think, just as a sense check. And this corresponds to what Pablo said, okay, that developed countries have lower automation risk in general. Okay, it's also true that within the set of countries we know, it's also true that poorer countries, countries with lower GDP per capita, also have higher automation risk. Okay, and so this is a very robust finding here. Okay, and so how should we interpret this? You know, so I'm a little bit tempted to think, you know, these countries over here, there's a lot of like an automation dividend to come. Okay, so we know that at least for some automation technologies, they add a lot to productivity. Okay, we know kind of one of the core parts of the kind of asymptotic ripple theory is that maybe after some time, or for certain types of technologies, they displace more work than they create work through productive technologies. I think it's supremely unlikely that the kind of technology that Kenya and Ghana need fall into that category. Okay, so what this tells me is perhaps one reason these countries are poor is because there's a lot of work that could be done by machines that isn't currently being done by machines. Okay, so this to me speaks less of a threat to the employment of Kenya and Ghana, more, there's this large automation dividend potentially to come there. One other thing I did, again, sort of out of curiosity, so this is this is agricultural employment, okay, on the vertical axis, and this is that kind of high automation risk measure. Okay, so this is really not a very strong correlation, but it looks like countries with lower agricultural employment kind of have higher automation risk. Okay, this I found a little bit surprising. Okay, because if I think about the agricultural sector of Laos, again, I'm not, as you can imagine, an expert, but I can imagine it's nowhere near as mechanized as the agricultural sector of the US, say. Okay, so there's probably a lot of potential to automate agriculture in Laos. And yet, you can see it shows up as a country that has kind of low, high automation risk. Okay, so why might that be? So one conjecture I have is, when we use automation risk scores from the US, a farmer in the US is basically like a high-tech entrepreneur. A farmer in Laos is very much not. Okay, so potentially part of what we see here is the effect of pulling in definitions that are based on kind of US occupations and using them directly in this context. Okay, so maybe one kind of exciting way to take this work is to directly construct measures of automation risk in a more relevant context rather than taking it from the US. Okay, but as a first step, I can see why the authors have done this. Okay, so let me wrap up. So yeah, in terms of my specific comments, I think one thing that would be exciting is to make more of this really interesting cross-country heterogeneity. Okay, it's very unfortunate that the sample is small, but maybe even adding in developed countries, there's nothing wrong with comparing maybe across the development spectrum. I think this is really fertile soil for future research. And one note of caution is that I'd be careful about directly taking these automation risk scores based on US or on European occupations or whatever and applying them kind of directly. Okay, so big picture, what this did make me think is, is there this kind of automation dividend out there? Might it be that increased automation would actually not so much threaten living standards for workers in Ghana, but instead, there might be a lot of potential to improve productivity. Since arguably, at the level of automation that those countries are at, we haven't really reached what Samoglou and Restrepo call the kind of so-so stage of technological deployment, in which we're automating jobs that really don't add very much productivity to the economy. And then I had here a big picture question, which is, kind of the main threats to developing economies from new technologies. But since we're going to have a couple of papers that are going to talk exactly about these issues, maybe I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so thank you very much again, and thank you, Pablo. I really enjoyed reading the paper.
Thank you, Joseba. Very interesting comments. If you can send me the slide later, I will be very
of course,
grateful.
of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joseba. We have maybe time for one question. Is there any? So if you're in the general public, you can write them in the Q&A. If you're a panelist, you could just interrupt and ask.
So I have one suggestion. Perhaps it would be better to think of middle income countries and then really poor ones. And I guess this is related to what Joseba was saying. I think some of these automation structures actually would fit, or methodology would fit better, even if you think of a Chile, a Brazil. Is not clear to me once you go to Haiti, Nicaragua, or some of the other countries you have. It's so easy, but also the implications are easier to see also in a middle income country than in a poorer one, because there's a reason why they're so poor. But perhaps it's just a suggestion of how to group the countries and market a little bit the findings.
Thank you, Laura. I think it's a great idea and it's consistent with what Joseba was saying. Actually, definitely something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo and Laura. So there will be a slight change in the program. I will now talk about my own paper, and then Laura and her co-authors will wrap up the session at the end. So Sorry for the change. So without further ado, let me continue. It leads well into what Pablo was just talking about. So that might be okay. So this is joint work with Alex Janiak, who's here, Jose Tesada, who's here, and Mario Geldres, who's an ex-student of ours. And this is actually something that came out of Mario's master's student. We got so puzzled by the result that he obtained that we decided to keep on basically searching for answers. And so there is evidence that Western economies have experienced labor market polarization over the last 50 years. So there's plenty of evidence for the US, for Western Europe, and even from Australia. So this implies that employment and wages are growing more in the extreme of the distribution than in the center. And this has been explained due to technological change within a task framework, where new technologies are argued to have replaced routine activities, and that these activities were traditionally performed by middle income or middle education workers. So the blue collar worker is the one who is the most at risk in this world, while the service low-income workers or the high-income tech worker is unaffected. And we have more limited evidence in developing countries. And this is, going to relate very well to what Pablo was saying, because the questions are basically aligned. Are the same technologies adopted in countries? We'll focus more on what I would call emerging economies. Is technological change occurring at the same place? And are there differences in where in the income distribution the affected occupations are located? So we will try to do this, restricting ourselves to Latin America, not South America, Laura. We will have Mexico here, which will, so we only have 5 countries, but that's 2/3 of the region's population and 3/4 of its GDP. So we think that we are basically focusing on the big players. And so, where do we fit in this literature? I just cited that there's evidence on polarization in rich economies. And there's also all this theoretical framework on the task technological change that has produced different predictions than the skill bias technological change had brought to the table previously. And internationally, the main evidence is very related to what Pablo was presenting, is this notion of what is the fraction of employment at risk of being automatized. But we really want to understand what's happening, not just what is the risk, but what is the actual evolution of employment. And here, the only country where there's some evidence at play is Mexico, with 3 different papers that have looked at this. And Pablo has already mentioned the work of Bill and his co-author that looked at census data from a large number of countries and looking at big groups of occupations. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on fewer countries, but more homogeneous in Latin America. And we're going to focus on a fairly detailed set of occupations and really think about the distribution of wages more than the theoretical risk that robots or automation may have had. So what is the preview of our results? We find no evidence of polarization, neither in employment nor in wages in Latin America over the last 30 years. The occupations growth has occurred throughout the income distribution, although not evenly between countries. And this is robust if we use hours or jobs of employment share. And the wage growth has been actually concentrated in the occupations with the lowest initial wages. And we'll try to argue that part of this is the fact that in some countries, there's been a very substantial increase in minimum wage over this period. And so why is it that we're not finding polarization? We don't find much evidence that the technological change is not affecting the same type of occupations in emerging economies than in richer ones. But rather it's because these automatable occupations were never middle class occupations in the region. And so the same kind of process of technological change is not going to lead to this hollowing out of the wage distribution as has been the case in the US. So now that I've said the end of the movie, let me go and try to describe how we get to this. So we really have as a goal, reconstructing the famous figures of this hollowing out from author JP paper. And we are basically trying to find the data that we need to do this. So to do that, we need in each country occupations. And so we're going to basically look for what is available, and we end up in the labor force survey or the household survey, depending on the country. We construct in the base year the average wage of all individuals in an occupation and the fraction of the workforce that is employed in that base year. Then we rank these occupations by the average wage in the base year. And then we assign them to percentile in the income distribution in that base year. So if the lowest average wage occupation has 5% of the workforce, the first 5% of the wage distribution in that country will be associated to that occupation. Some occupations have more than one percentile, as I've just given you an example, but some, in other cases, we have percentiles where we have more than one occupation because the occupation is relatively small. And then what we do is we ask what is happening to the growth of these occupations in terms of wage and employment over the 30 period, depending on the country. And so we argue that that's going to be the change in that percentile. Okay, so mathematically, for each percentile P in year Y, we're going to construct a change in the employment or the wage of that percentile, where what we do is simply weight the occupational growth between the base year and whatever year Y we're calculating this, and we weight this by the occupation weight in that percentile in the base year. Okay, and so we're going to do this for employment and for wages, and then we're going to smooth these curves by taking moving average lowest is actually what we do in state. Okay. And so we're going to use what are the countries that we focus on. As I said, we try to look at the big players. So Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru. The one that should be there is Argentina, but the inflation problem is generating a bit of problem getting reliable data. So that's why it's not there. In each case, we use whatever data set that we could find that included occupation, wages, hours, and employment. And so for Brazil, we're going to use the PNAD. That starts in 1987. We were going to use from 1992 onward, because none of the other countries had data from the 80s. So to make it more comparable, we're starting in 92. For Colombia, we used the GEIH that starts only in 2007. For Chile, we use CACEN from 96 to 2012. The latest wave is going to be available soon, but we don't have it there. For Mexico, we use the ENOE from 1992 onward. For Peru, the ENAJO in 2004 onward. And Colombia, Mexico, and Peru go until 2020. So I'll present you the results dropping 2020, just in case COVID is messing the path, but actually it doesn't make much of a difference. So it doesn't seem like the results are very much altered by whether we include 2020 or not. Then the big task is to try to generate a uniform set of occupations over the full period. So we started with Brazil and Chile, and we were super happy. Both we were able to generate a match to the International Occupational Codes of CU 88. But then it got more complicated as we moved along. And so instead of matching to a uniform international code, we decided to privilege the capacity to generate a balanced panel within the country. So for Colombia, we're going to use the SENA 70. For Mexico, we merge a few categories of the Cinco to generate a balanced panel. And for Peru, we use the Cieno 95. If we had gone to CU, we would have lost a lot of categories. So that's why we chose, at least for today, to use this definition. So this gives us 79 categories in Brazil, 82 for Colombia, 100 for Mexico, and 60 for Peru, which is relatively more detailed than what you can find in IPOMS, for example, in the international crosswalks. Then we basically do something very similar to what Pablo did, and we match the occupation to a degree of routine or not. And then the main task it performs, if it's the math, finger, DCP, STS, and EHF, which I'll use the non-cognitive, the non-routine or routine term for each of them, but that's what they are. So just, what does this polarization means in the context of the US? So this is copied from Otter. Basically, what you see is that between the 30th and the 60th percentile of the initial wage distribution, you have occupations that are shrinking, while at the two tails, you have occupations that are growing. And so we will try to replicate this, this graph and see what it gives us. So this is for Brazil. I'm not seeing a U, even if I'm squinting. This is Chile, so you should look at the blue and the red line. Again, if anything, this is an inverse U for Chile. It doesn't seem to be picking up until the 95th percentile or something like that at the tail. This is for Colombia. So the occupations that are shrinking are actually at the bottom in Colombia. This is Mexico, which is a pattern that again does not, if there's a U, it's really late in the distribution. And this is Peru. And so basically, we've done this in a number of ways, and they always seem to look in the same pattern. So we're not finding the stylized pattern that was emphasized by Otter and other authors in richer economies. We don't find that there's evidence that the middle of the wage distribution is growing slower. For Colombia and Brazil, maybe it's the lowest part of the distribution that is affected. For Chile, Mexico, and Peru, actually the lowest point seems to be close to the 80th percentile, so much more to the right than richer economies. So why is this happening? This could be due to two different reasons. First, it could be that technological change is not adopted in the same way in emerging economies. And so, what Joseba was talking about before, that maybe this is a automatizable occupation in the US, but it's not the case in a poorer context. Or the other thing is that the technological change is affecting the same occupations, but they were not located in the same point in the initial distribution. So to do this, what we look at is classifying these occupations by routine and non-routine. What is happening to the growth? So what I'm presenting here is the non-routine occupation employment growth compared to the routine ones. So something above 1, and all of them are above 1, means that occupations that are non-routine would be growing faster than the ones in that are routine. And what we're seeing is that all of them are above 1. And I've ranked them by GDP per capita. And what you see is that as the countries get poorer, this difference is shrinking, but remaining above 1. So it does seem like as in richer economies, emerging economies are experiencing a higher grade growth in non-routine occupations than routine ones, and this seems to be increasing with income, although I don't have the nice graph that Joseba made against GDP, but I think you can make it in your head and you should be able to see that. If we go a little bit more detail and we use these 5 categories that Otter, Levy, and Murnane have. So now I'm presenting the relative growth of an occupation vis-a-vis what is the math or the non-routine analytical, which is usually the most benefited by technological change and automation. And what we're finding is that all these are below 1. So in all these countries, despite their diversity, math occupations are growing faster than any other. And in general, the non-routines follow. So this is the blue and the orange ones. But again, not in all. And as we go to poorer and poorer economies, this pattern seems to be a bit breaking down. So for example, in Peru, there's a large increase in routine cognitive occupations, which are exactly the ones that in the US, clerks, tellers, that type of occupation that disappeared because of automation. So it doesn't seem to be a one size fit all, but we don't seem to see a pattern where things are completely different from richer economies. And so it's a little bit difficult to explain then why we are seeing this difference in employment polarization in these countries. And so the second hypothesis is that these routine occupations that were very quickly automatizable are not in the same location in the wage distribution. And there seems to be truth for that in almost all countries. So this is Brazil. So you're seeing that the most routine occupations are actually the lowest paid one. And then, we go up to 80, the percentile 80th, where we see some sort of routine work. Chile is even more marked at the lower scale and then peaks around 60 to 80. This is Colombia, again, at the lower tail and as high as 80. The only country in our sample that does not seem to have this pattern is Mexico. Is this because it's more trading with the US? It has, some similar wage patterns. I don't know. But even then, you still see that the routine occupations are very dominant, even at high points of the distribution. And this is Peru, where the lowest share is even bigger. And so what we argue is that this seems to be the number one reason why we are not seeing the same type of pattern is that in Latin America, the middle class was not doing these routine occupations that the robots and machines were able to replace relatively quickly. So then we ask ourselves, what about wages? So again, I'm showing the picture from David's work in the US, where we see, in some years a U shape and in others, basically a positively shaped curve, suggesting that either we have lower wage growth in the middle or in the lower tail. And so we replicate this in Latin America, And we get, again, a very different pattern. So occupations that were in the lowest percentile in the base year are the ones who are growing the fastest. And this is the case for Brazil, for Colombia, although it's a little bit moved to the right. For Chile, this is we should look at the green curve here. Mexico, again, is more muted, but if there's anything, it does look like a negative trend, and Peru. And so this is a bit surprising, and we're still very much trying to understand this. And so our first idea was to think that maybe there were some policies implemented in the region over the last 25 years that did play this role. And so this is just a simple graph showing that in general in the region, although particularly in two countries that we don't have, which is Argentina and Uruguay, the minimum wage has grown tremendously over this period. And so in Chile, we ask how much of this change in the wage, that downward curve we saw, can be explained by an increase in the minimum wage. So we do something pretty simple. We take all the individuals in 1996, which is our base year in Chile. We say if you earn more than the new minimum wage of 2017, which was something like 200% higher than the one in 1996, we're going to keep your wage unchanged. But if you earn less than this new minimum wage, we're going to assume that your wage went up to the new minimum wage. Okay, so this is very crude approximation, but we're basically assuming that the only source of wage growth is the increase in minimum wage, that there's full compliance, and there's absolutely no spillover effects above the threshold. And when we do this, so this is the reality, the blue line is the reality, and the red line is our counterfactual. And what we're seeing is that for lower percentiles, it seems like a good chunk of the increase in occupational wages for these low percentile occupations is due to the minimum wage. And then it falls to almost zero for high wage workers, clearly because they don't earn the minimum wage. But then when we try to do this to other countries, we really face a struggle because of the size of the informal sector. So if I do this in Brazil or in Peru, I have these tons of workers who will never earn the minimum wage, and I'm bumping their wage to the minimum. So we need to rethink this, and we didn't have something ready for this presentation, but this is basically what we're thinking about. How is the elasticity of informality with respect to the minimum wage, and the elasticity of wages in the informal sector with respect to the minimum wage? And so to conclude, we find no evidence of employment polarization in Latin America over the last 25 years. And it does seem like the big winners of technological change in terms of occupations are the same, although there is differences across country. And something that is a bit scary, I think, is that a number of high-paid occupations in emerging economies are actually highly automatable. So this might be very different in the long run. And we also find no evidence of polarization in wages. Instead, this decrease in inequality, this is in percentage terms, so it doesn't necessarily mean that income inequality goes down, but this might be due in part to minimum wage policies. So without further ado, I will leave Bill for his comments, and then we will have questions.
Sorry, it's getting the screen. Okay. Can you see the screen? Yes? Okay. All right. So thanks very much.
It is a bit small, though.
It is small. Let's try to make it bigger. There we go. thanks very much for the chance to, I can't say read yet, but it will be read soon, I'm sure, and I will look forward to reading it. So I'm sure, because I'm putting together from the slides, and the slides are quite good, that I'm unclear on some things, and you can correct me, but just let me make some points as I go along. First of all, I think this is a very important paper in the making, as I think the previous one is too. In fact, this session is very important. At the most narrow are the forces that have led to polarization, the advanced countries linked to polarization in Latin America. There's a consensus in those countries that most of the polarization we've seen hasn't really been due to trade, but exactly to automation. And so the logical question is, why is that polarization? Why should we expect that polarization should only affect the OECD countries or the most advanced countries? And the flip side of that is, if we're not seeing polarization, and polarization is due to technological progress, is that good or bad news? Particularly if you're sitting in Chile and you haven't seen much productivity growth for 15 years. Should we be celebrating that we're not seeing any polarization, or is that just saying we're really bad at technological adoption and we need to work on that? The second slightly larger question is development strategy. We're all familiar with the premature deindustrialization literature by Danny, which is saying, exactly, we're going to lose these manufacturing jobs in the middle. And that can probably also be told as a story of greater ease of technological transfer in manufacturing than in a lot of other sectors, particularly services and even agriculture. And so that's why we're seeing these sectors contracting more quickly in the developing world, or their share contracting more quickly in the developing world than has been in the past. Although that would seem to be leaning towards polarization. And the third is the uber political question. And since this is a paper of Chileans, right now the big question coming out of the election and the constitutional reform is the model generating the benefits for all citizens, or do we really have to change something for that? And across the continent, this is the question. There's discontent and the shifting left. Is there anything coming out of, is that any of that due to some polarization, to loss of manufacturing jobs, or polarization in wages that this paper could eventually address? So I think we want to have this, the stylized facts of this out and well distributed when we get them down. So it kindly referred to my paper with poor Carlos, who did all the heavy lifting on this paper. And what we found, just briefly to lay my benchmark, is that we managed to reproduce, again, using the census with all the qualifications that they mentioned. And we managed to reproduce more or less that, for instance, operators and assemblers in advanced countries, their share had declined, craftsman related also declined, while the elementary occupations and service workers, and on the upper end, technicians, professionals, and legislators and managers both increased. And so that kind of reproduced the polarization in the advanced countries that have been found elsewhere. And we didn't find it as strongly, if at all, in the developing countries. So in this sense, we're on the same page. The one country that we sort of worried about, actually there were two, also Brazil, but I'll just put up Mexico because it stars in their story too, was Mexico, because you found at the extremes of elementary occupations and service workers at the low end, and then professionals, technicians, legislators, professionals, that those categories were expanding. But if you looked at, for instance, operators and assemblers or craftsmen related, the gray line from 2000 to 2010 was very much slower increase among them. And that's actually a result that seems replicated here. It doesn't say we're getting polarization, but it says that the operators and assemblers and technicians operators, assemblers, and craftsmen related categories are growing much slower than the others. So polarization might be pending. So this paper uses standard and high quality labor surveys from 5 big countries in Latin America to generate a wider set of occupations and focus on the distribution of the wages. The benefit of the census is it hands you common job categories But the present approach allows much more detail and tailoring the categories to those more common in the literature. In that sense, it's a big advance, and the deeper diving is very welcome. So just a couple queries. One is, are you really so sanguine in your conclusion that you see no polarization when you look at Mexico? Because it seems, this is over 20 years, I think, here. It does seem that you're finding sort of what we were finding, that routine manual category jobs are growing much more slowly than any other category. And Mexico is kind of an important country because it is the one that is most industrialized. So it suggests that if you wanted to watch what happens to industrial sectors and manual labor, if you will, or routine tasks in industry, this would be a place you'd look. And I look at that and I say, yeah, we're not seeing polarization yet, but I don't think we're immune somehow yet. And that makes me worry that, again, the problem might be we're adopting technologies a little bit too slowly in Mexico, exactly for the reason that Jeanne gave, is more plugged into the US economy. And so they're a harbinger of what may yet come. I wasn't sure how to interpret this graph, which I think has been modified, if I'm not mistaken, and so I could be totally hallucinating on what's going on. But when I look at 1979 to 89, it seems a change in employment share is exactly what we would love to see, in the sense that poorer skill categories are growing slowly or disappearing, and everyone's kind of moving up to higher skill categories, and that looks cool. That's what we'd like in the long run. But then when I look at 2000 to 2012, I'm seeing this U-shaped thing where the categories are growing a lot for the really low skills and somewhat less a lot, but more for the higher skill. And we're in the middle, they seem to be declining. So I'm probably reading this wrong. And it does seem that when you take it country by country, we don't see these effects. So is there something weird going on compositionally, or am I just misreading this figure? You can set me straight. The wage growth curves are a really nice approach, and it's pretty big news if it's true. And I want to believe it's true. They all appear downward sloping. The poorer section of the population is doing fabulous compared to all of us in Las Condes. And the first question I have is like, when you do this, or the political version of the paper, having a map to the Gini or to Thiel or something like that would be great to show. Yeah, and this is driving just reduction in income distribution in income inequality in Latin America. That would be a fantastic finding to demonstrate if we can do that. I think in the final paper, it'd be great if you were really explicit about where manufacturing jobs are in the distribution, because you're right, but they're probably a little higher. When you said at one point that the routine jobs are at the lower part of the distribution, and I may have misheard that, I was a little confused just because I would normally associate those jobs at the higher end, not where we are, but up there. The other thing I worry a bit about is Juliana Londoño did a really nice piece with Colombian tax records a while ago. And just because all these fantastic labor market surveys you're using are top coded. And when you get their actual tax records, which are probably also not fully accurate, but all of a sudden we see, these guys at the top are making a lot more money than we think. And then the big progress in reducing inequality is higher, and the decreases in the Gini in Colombia were much less pronounced, or has been rising. That used to go away. So I don't know. We have to be a little bit careful, just because, again, when you hear the discourse in Latin America, it's like people are driving around Sanhattan in Ferraris while we're starving. And if you're missing the Ferrari guys because they're top coded, then we're not getting the whole picture. I like the minimum wage angle, although it's going to complicate and make your story messy. But you probably have to pursue it. I get the feeling you stole this graph quickly from Mauricio, and that's great. I would love to see the evolution as a share of the median wage over time. I know you put it in, but it'd make it easier for me to see what's going on. Also, flesh out a little bit conceptually how this is going to affect polarization, because if you're lower end, really, there's not much enforcement. I think Laura said something about that. There's not a lot of enforcement at the lower end, and it's really the factories where you can go in, or where that are unionized in the case of Argentina, where these things are mandated, or in Colombia, where for some reason they're really good at enforcing. And isn't that the center of our distribution that's going to get whacked? And wouldn't we expect to see some decline in employment share there? So your story is going to get messy. I'm not saying you don't have to go into it, but we have to clarify how we're going to identify between effects and how that might confuse it. The minimum wage and informality story, that's also going to get messy. You're exactly right to worry about the impact of the minimum wage on wages in the informal sector. I just put in this old graph that Jairo Nunez and I did for Colombia, and you saw that the minimum wage not only threw a kink in the formal sector, but it threw a huge kink in the informal sector distribution of wages too. And that varies a lot by country. If you go back to Mrs. Heckman and Carmen Page's book of the Pleistocene era, and it varies a lot by country. So you're exactly right. You got to be looking at the elasticity of wages. But the other thing I worry about is if this is happening in the informal sector, then we got to be looking at who's getting bumped out of the informal sector and into unemployment. And it's actually, when I thought about that, it's like, I'm not really sure how we're dealing with unemployment in these exercises in particular. You might want to be explicit about that. So the minimal evidence of polarization, good news or bad news, they find that the same types of effects are resulting from automation. I guess that's good, because that means that we're not qualitatively different animals from the rest of the world. And again, we talked about these are not middle-level occupations anyway. We need more detail on that. And it might have been that for most of the region, we weren't really assembly powerhouses anyway, so we shouldn't expect this huge loss. But Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico are kind of exceptions, and we need to understand them better. And Mexico does send a flag for me. And just to wind up, maybe this is just the flip side of a very low growth and productivity of the region over time, that we're the same animals as everybody else. We're just less good at adopting technologies. That's what we're growing slowly. It's worth noting that before COVID, from 2010 to 2019, we grew at 2.2% as a region when the world was growing at about 4.1. And we can tell all sorts of stories about commodity prices, but nonetheless, it's suggestive that we have a low growth problem and a low technology adoption problem. So anyway, I want to see where this paper is going. I urge you, I know we're facing all sorts of problems of shutdowns and children staying home and stuff like that, but I think this is a very important paper. And I'm sorry if I miscategorized anything, but I really want to follow where it's going. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Bill, for these very careful and thoughtful remarks. I think it gives us a lot to think about. In the Q&A, Deborah is asking if we look at public versus private sector, and we do not so far. So this is another interesting thing as the informal formal sector division. We might want to look at how much of this is public sector employment or private sector employment. However, due to time constraint, I suggest that we move on to the next paper to make sure that Laura has all the time that she needs to present her the results. So go ahead, Laura.
Can you see my slides? Okay, great. Thank the organizers for putting this paper in the program. COVID continues to create chaos all over. One of the chaos was that they shut down the statistical office in Colombia, among many other. And so our sincere apologies to our discussant. He had to deal with our different COVID shocks. And so we really appreciate the comments, because we do know we sent him some very sad set of slides, but hopefully this will allow us at least to think a little bit about the problem. So our paper is actually going to pick up some of the themes that we were discussing. Again, in this group, it's not necessarily this motivation, but as you know, the structural transformation where countries have these secular changes that they go from agriculture, manufacturing, and services has been observed for rich and even emerging and developing countries. There has been also a lot of work that has documented the differences between these early industrializers and what we call the late starters. So for sure, we're not going to claim we're breaking ground there. But what we want to focus in this paper is in a subset of facts, if you want, at the macro and micro level that caught our attention. And these are related to what we call jobless industrialization, but also in a world of very small, tiny firms. And to document these facts, we have been exploiting very rich micro level data sets, plant level, economic, household surveys, spanning over 70 years or so. So again, some of these macro facts, as I said, have been noted and documented in the literature, in particular, the fact that there is this jobless industrialization for less starters. The paper by Roderick was mentioned. However, we're going to zoom in a somewhat related but different fact that is not per se this late industrialization or the change in employment in emerging markets, but the fact that industrialization never gave us as many jobs as it did in early industrializing countries. And I think this actually does relate to some of the things Jeanne was mentioned. So our jobs were never as many in manufacturing. But then we're going to complement with micro level facts, that is that our economic structures are disproportionately dominated by tiny productive units. And what we argue is that this heterogeneity is behind our low employment generation. So it's just very hard to generate, or these very tiny firms are just not generating as much work. It also happens to be that disproportionately, these tiny firms are informal firms and are in low skill manufacturing, and particular low skill service. So again, these tiny units that tend to be informal are not allowing us to generate a lot of employment. Conversely, one can see it the other way, is that we just don't have a lot of large that generated formal jobs. So it could be, the problem can be seen on both sides. And again, there's capital intensity, biases in formality that can explain some of these problems, productivity, the lack of large firms. And so the way we're aiming to approach this, and I emphasize aiming because here is where we got some shocks, is that we're constructing this very long-term time series of micro data. In general, this is hard to find, even in rich countries. It's even harder in emerging markets. So we see this as a contribution of the project. Colombia, it turns out, actually has a lot of this data. And so Felipe and Marcela have been putting this together. So hopefully at one point, we're going to be able to present you very detailed micro data for over 70 years. There is going to be a combination of the industrial census that starts in 1945, the service and the commerce census that started in 1954, the agricultural census that also has data since the 60s. They also have been collecting since 1955 plant level manufacturing data. As it is now, right now we have it since 1971, but the idea is to go back. And there's also household surveys that include information on employer firm size since 1971. So as I said, we're hoping to put together all of this data for Colombia, and it would be nice if similar projects can be undertaken in other countries or in Latin America, because many countries actually did collect a lot of this data, but as it is, we're doing it for Colombia. And we're going to complement the data with other information out there of economic transformation databases and so on. So we then, in the project, we aim to interpret our stylized facts through a model that sees the world through three sectors. So it's going to be agricultural sector, and if you want, a modern urban and a traditional urban. So we don't see these per se as sectorial in that sense, but more of these formal and informal, because as I mentioned, you do see good manufacturing, if you want, good high-skill sector services that tend to be formal, but we tend to see more what we call in traditional informality in low-skill services, say retail and restaurants, and also some low-skill in manufacturing. So we see this transition where the agricultural jobs came to the urban sector, but not all of them could be, if you want, employed in the formal sector, manufacturing services, and they all start to be employed in informal manufacturing services job in the urban sector. And again, it's these informal firms that are escaping some of this cost of formality. In the second part of the paper, we aim to quantify the model to match micro and macro level facts from Colombia. As of right now, we have a simple calibration that does show that reducing by half the wages does the wages in labor does allow for explaining some of these jobless industrialization. And so far we have what we call, if you want, a numerical simulation that does show that changing the firm's size distribution also contributes to eliminating some of this jobless industrialization. It's a simulation because, again, as I'm going to continue to apologize, the data source was shut down. It was also hacked, so we had like many shocks at the same time. In terms of related literature, I don't want to take a lot of your time. There's, as I said, a lot of work that has explored structural changes. Many of you have contributed to that. The work by Danish Roderick on premature industrialization has been mentioned, and there's also this early development literature by Luis Harris Todaro that had mentioned these of, he was thinking more of agriculture going to manufacturing, but there's a spirit of this in what we do. A lot of work documenting the differences in firm size distribution, rich and poor countries, and also the role of services. And again, there's a broad literature to the one this paper relates. So broadly, the paper aims to present that someday the macro facts. We now give you a small benchmark, then some micro facts, the model, and some calibration simulation. So let me start with this figure. Let me focus here on Colombia. We have these the dots in red that are full, like painted fully. I forgot how to say this. Represent employment. The one that are just the little circles represent value added. So the literature has emphasized this fact that value added has come down in manufacturing in Colombia and emerging markets in many poorer countries. It has emphasized in particular in Latin America, and has talked a lot about this hump shape. But when we look at this picture, more than the hump shape, what we thought was interesting was the fact that we never employed a lot of people in manufacturing. Even at its peak, employment was never more than 50%. And Felipe has called this difference the divorce. I don't want to ask him if this is bringing back some memories from somewhere else, but he insists that there is this divorce in employment and value added in Colombia, in Latin America. When you compare with the US, you do see this divorce. So in the US has seen this deindustrialization, but value added and employment go together. It is not the case in Colombia. We never employ as many people, even when accounting for this hump shape, even accounting for the maximum value added that was produced in the country. This, again, this difference is employment and value added. We can see it in Colombia relative to the US, but we also document that this is the case for what we call early industrializers and late starters. So Colombia is the red one. Again, you see here employment. In blue, we see Latin America. When you go and compare the employment versus value added, you see the same. Independently of where you're thinking, if it's increasing, decreasing, there's the industrialization. It just never employed as many people as the ones that you see employed in the early industrializers. In this case, it would be United States and Europe. Asia is interesting, it's a little bit in between. And in Africa as well. In this case, we're gonna focus on Latin America because we have more detailed data. In the slides we share with Federico, we do some regression analysis that compares other regions. And so one can say, well, a simple framework that can account for this difference. We have a simple Cobb-Douglas, we have competitive inputs, and what we can do is just make labor more expensive. So we can put a wedge to make labor more expensive, and this will create this divorce between the value added and the employment shares. And so if this wedge tau is equal to 1, that is the US. If its tau is greater than 1, that would be Colombia, that would be Latin America. So we could take this simple approach. However, we argue that this simple approach is not going to capture some of our additional microfacts, that is the dominance of a lot of those little firms that are just not absorbing employment. And these little firms carry a larger weight in Latin America relative to this early industrialization. As I said, this is particularly the case in certain services, retail, in restaurants, and so on, but it's also the case in certain type of manufacturing. So it is also the case that these tiny firms are disproportional informal firms. And what is interesting is that informal firms, in theory, are precisely there not to face the wedge. So they're there to, or in general, they avoid paying minimum wage, but also don't pay the disproportional taxes that sometimes are also associated with formality. We also argue that this firm size distribution disproportionately weighted on small little firms also matters for aggregate sector productivity. And we're going to show that in a moment. And so again, these are some of the stylized facts that we hope one day to completely bring to you, but this is employment under 10, the share of employment with 10 employees. We compare here advanced economies. It tends to be 70% in manufacturing, going up to 80 in retail and 88 in services. When we compare to Latin America, it's more, 91%, 96%. In Colombia, 87, 96%. Again, you do see this economy dominated by little firms. When we do employment weighted, we all know that it goes, so the share is lower in terms of when we weight by employment, but again, disproportional employment in Latin America is in these tiny firms. So it would be 11% in rich countries, 30% in Latin America, 31% in Colombia, and similar in some other sectors. When we go and compare the share of informal workers, here's when we see that a lot of these tiny firms are simply informal firms. A lot of the work is just informal work. And we document here for Latin America, in different, again, a lot of these tiny firms, informal is just 10%, but when we go and look at the informal, we're going to numbers close to 60, 80, 70%. This is the case in Latin America. This is also the case, in particular case of Colombia. When we go to the US, the share in small firms tends to be less in manufacturing, a little bit more in retail. We also document that this has been the case since the 50s. We may have seen perhaps a little increase in the share of tiny firms, but this has been the case in the industrialization and the development and the structural change of Colombia. This is the case in many Latin American countries. We have been, for the last 70 years, dominated by these tiny little firms. And so what we want to do is bring these stylized facts. And the way to think about it is, as we said, first, there has to be a wedge. And we're going to think of this wedge as the cost of employment in the urban sector. As I said, this is not only minimum wage, but it's also taxation and all the regulation that comes with formality. And this is going to be also some bias of technology against labor, if you want, in favor of capital, that is also going to correlate with firm size. As I mentioned, we're going to have 3 sectors. Because this segmentation is more than per se industry services or even agriculture, is more modern and backwards. Because we do see this different firm size distribution in both sectors. And we can think of perhaps some idea of organizational capital as a defining part of the modern sector. And so we're going to have a three-sector economy. We're going to have agriculture, urban traditional, and urban model, urban modern. The backwards, or agriculture and urban traditional, are going to have the agriculture is going to have decreasing returns to scale. There might be some other input land. The urban traditional, is going to be just some linear technology. Heterogeneity in this case is irrelevant. When we go into the modern, it gets a little bit more interesting. We're going to think of some non-TF of labor and capital, but there's going to be a productivity shock that is going to affect both the TFP, but also is going to affect some the adoption of capital. And as Martí has nicely shown, we can later turn this production function into a CES, and he's there in case you want more discussion of the proof of this beautiful theorem. But again, we can think of a competitive market that's going to have this labor wedge. We're going to have market clearance. We're going to have to employ labor in the three sectors. We're going to have profits maximization, and we're going to have the urban traditional. We're going to normalize to one, and it's going to pin the wages. And so, as I said, there is a very nice transformation from our production function into a very nice CES. And so the model is going to first emphasize the role of labor wages that's going to distort the amount of labor, but also the role of the firm size distribution affecting the productivity, and also the bias between capital and labor. And these variables are all going to be key in explaining the jobless industrialization. So now we have performed a very simple calibration. We're going to take the sectors as perfect substitutes. We're just not going to worry too much about dynamics. We're going to calibrate the model to 1990 in Colombia using the firm size distribution in the urban modern, using the encuesta of manufacturing, the distribution of the different sectors, and we're going to assume that the traditional accounts for 75% of value added. We're going to use this to assess the importance of the labor wages for jobless industrialization. A little bit by construction, the calibration is going to replicate the jobless industrialization, 30% of employment and 75% of urban value added is going to be the targets of the calibration. And through the dense of the model, this is accounting for 50% of value add. So again, these are some of the parameters. As I said, some of these are being matched a little bit by construction, which is what we're trying to get from the model. Perhaps what is more interesting from this calibration is that, I'm sorry, let me just one thing. So the wages that are implied by calibration, we found to be a cost extra of capital of labor of 37%, which if you actually think the cost of minimum wage and all the taxation and regulation, we actually thought that it was not completely crazy numbers. So we were happy even with this very simple attempt. So if you start with this 37%, if we lower it by half, we can get that is going to increase employment to 60%, and is going to match output share to 60%, which would be turning Colombia into something like the US. This of turning or having the wedge also means that the traditional informal sector becomes almost insignificant, because we still have it, it's still doing a little bit what the Lewis models were doing, is pinning down wages. If we completely get rid of the wedge and turn it into one, now we don't pin the wages by this traditional sector, and we start seeing increases in wages. So again, this just made us feel a little bit better or comfortable in that it can explain some of the stylized facts that we're presenting. We also played with the role of firm size distribution. And again, this is just some mechanical changes in the parameters. we want to use the data to discipline this numerical exercise, but it does show that if you reduce the tail, so it does show that the results are sensitive to the tail of the distribution. So if you change the parameter from 0.83 to 0.8, so if you're giving less weight to these small firms, you're gonna see an increase in the employment share in the modern sector that is starting to look like the value added. So again, in this case, it would be quantitatively comparable to changes in the labor wedge. And so we want to then see how much we can explain of the facts by changing these different parameters. But as I mentioned, we want to discipline it with the data. And so again, for later is we're gonna try to think what are the implications of starting late industrialization. Early industrializers, I mean, if you have seen the movies and read all of the books, they talk about hard working conditions and the gradual improvement of wages and labor. If you're a late starter, you started perhaps with a lot of the welfare. And as I said, part of the problem may be the way we tax this welfare that is in many of these Latin American countries is actually linked to formal employment. So it's not only minimum wage, as I said, it's that many countries actually do tax explicitly formal employment. But again, this is something we want to think later. And just to conclude, we're trying to think about the structural differences in late and early industrialization. We want to look not only at the macro facts, that there is this divorce between what was generated as value added in manufacturing and what was employed through the lens of economies that have a disproportionate number of tiny informal firms that are there in the urban sector, both in manufacturing, but overwhelmingly in services. We do argue that the role of heterogeneity and informality is important to understand this structural change. And we do think it's important to have this very long panel of plant level data to understand better and incorporate these facts in the model. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura. Now, Federico.
Great. Can you see my screen? Okay. Okay, so thanks for inviting me to present this paper. And given my affiliation to the bank, the usual disclaimer applies. So this is a super interesting, ambitious, and exciting project. I know it's in an early stage, but I had a lot of fun going through the analysis and thinking about these issues. So the goal that the way I sort of processed it is to study labor market frictions, or frictions more in general, regulations along the development path using both micro and macro analysis, and in particular how it differs between early and late developers. And the authors argue for late developers facing more frictions at early stages. So for early developers, the idea they have in mind is that social policy was sort of implemented after industrialization, whereas for late developers, it happened during or even before in some cases. And that's going to generate differences in terms of how much employment can grow, and that's going to affect the development path. So I'm going to focus my attention on three comments. First on the facts, second on the mechanism, and then sort of taking a step back and thinking about the research question more in general. Obviously, I might have processed or understood some of the slides. So all of any issues there are on my end, but I'm just trying to kind of put some ideas there to think more about this project. I think it's really exciting. Okay, so on the first fact, on the first comment about facts, which has to do with this value-added employment gap. It's a super interesting feature of the development process. The authors claim that the late developers have a larger gap than early developers. But I think there's more they can do with the data to kind of show this. So for example, they bundle Asia and they show this gap for Asia, but Asia has a combination of early and late developers, such as Japan, which is an early developer, and Thailand, which is a late developer. Then for the US, it is not clear that there was not such a gap at the beginning. So what I did is that I took the data that we use in our paper with Roger's son, the sort of historical data from the US going back to the end of the 19th century. So I projected this, I mean, obviously the data is not as smooth as it's shown here. I projected the data with a polynomial on real GDP per capita, and then I projected what came out of that of the model. And it's true that, you know, at the end of the sort of development process of the US, these two things, the employment and the value added share, are really close to one another. But if you go sort of further back, there is a gap. The gap is maybe at the beginning 5 percentage points, then it goes down to maybe 2.5, 3 percentage points, and then it disappears. But there was certainly something going on at the beginning. So you can think of an alternative presentation of the facts. You could say something like, all countries have some degree of value-added employment gap. This happens at the beginning of the industrialization process, and the gap shrinks along the development path. And you can see this, well, this is the graph that I just showed you on the right-hand side, but the left-hand side is what they have on the paper. You can see that for Colombia, actually, the gap also goes down and sort of shrinks over time. For Latin America, for the overall graph, you also see a little bit of this. And for Africa, you see it even more. Okay, the second comment is sort of which mechanism can explain the gap. So I want to push in this direction of thinking about whether firm heterogeneity is necessary for the argument. So if the paper is about the timing of social policy and industrialization, it does not seem necessary. You can think of different ways of approaching that sort of mechanism in a different way. The current counterfactual actually revealed that heterogeneity is not sort of key, except for the last one. I think the last one where you move the sigma parameter is sort of going in the right direction, but like at least the one that has to do with moving the wedge, you could get the main result without going through firm heterogeneity. Obviously, the firm heterogeneity is nice. The firm level data is amazing. You can bring more facts to sort of support your mechanism, and that's totally fine. And it's also interesting in itself, but what I'm saying here is that it's maybe not necessary for the story to go through. Plus, if you want to do it sort of compare apples with apples, you would have to do, or would be nice to have something similar for an early developer at an early stage of development, and not the US now. And I'm not sure that data is available. So if the author want to push this, I think it's key to convince that that's the sort of relevant margin relative to early developers, and that's where we should be focusing on. But I also want to sort of point out that if the goal is to explain the gap, there are other mechanisms that seem relevant but are absent. And the most natural to think about is international trade. So international trade for late developers that import technology from early developers. So workers in early developers had to both build and use machines, right? But now for late developers, they only have to use machines because they can build and they can import them from somewhere else. And that could be one way of rationalizing why there's a gap. And if you sum to that the IT technology sort of revolution, then you can think of, you know, these countries are developing through services instead of manufacturing. And that's going to be one reason why, you know, you're going to see a different pattern from late versus early developers. And then the other sort of role of capital, both in the data and in the model. I know that getting data on capital historically is kind of more difficult, but I think this is sort of also useful to think about in terms of differences across different types of countries. And then let me finish with some alternative research questions. I think they point out in the slides the sort of idea of thinking about the role of firm heterogeneity in the process of social transformation in developing countries, kind of more in general, not just focusing on the gap, on this value-added employment gap. I think that's super interesting, but maybe somewhat different to try to explain the value-added employment gap. There are other frictions you can think about in terms of financial frictions, organizational frictions that imply different firm dynamics and therefore different industrialization paths. So you can think something like, you know, how does the life cycle of firms vary over the development path? And that's something I haven't seen. I think it's super interesting. It's something like Cia and Clino 2014, but on misallocation along the development path. It wouldn't be comparing two different countries, but the same country for a long span with micro level detailed data. And then there's something different that I think Laura was sort of pointing this out. which is to understand why there's a low employment share manufacturing in several countries, especially late developers. And this is a different question, I think, than understanding the gap, the value-added employment gap. So, for example, in my work with Richard, we kind of show that agricultural productivity is actually super important to understand the heterogeneity of the development path across countries. But in our case, sectoral productivity is a primitive. It's something that is given. And the question is where is it coming from? And I think the data that you guys have and sort of the model you're thinking about could be something interesting to understand where this is coming from and therefore understand the differences in the development path that comes from micro level behavior. Okay, but let me finish this here. A super exciting project with interesting insights and combining macro micro analysis. This is the stuff that's super useful, and I look forward for the future versions of this.
Thank you, Federico. Are there questions from the panelists or attendees for Laura?
I mean, I can have a quick reaction to Federico's comment, which was, thank you so much, Federico, to the first point of social policy. Well, the thing is that in Latin America, the social policy has fallen into a few of just a handful of firms, especially very large. So we believe that the distribution is super important to really assess the timing, because regardless of the is this critical interaction of how are you going to create manufacturing, and especially if you have like this wedge that it is only be taken by a few, then that creates a source of heterogeneity that we really want to look into. And we all know that a big part of the problem of the social contract in our region is precisely that you cannot think of raising a lot of taxes because you're just charging a few. Almost everyone knows that, while the rest of the economy is by and large without taxation. So I think that the timing itself does not is not capable of capturing this reality of very tiny firms that cannot give a lot of value added. But I am with you in the sense that one needs to be agnostic. So that's the virtue of having this distribution story, because it might not be first order the case of distribution. We believe it is, but we're trying to make that assess quantitatively. So we think that's part of the value add of the project, of putting all these mechanisms, plausible mechanisms in the table, especially because each of them carry forward completely different policy implications. This story is it the story of technology, is the story of this type of funding, the social contract, and so on. So at this stage, of course, we cannot give you the definite answer on that regard, but we believe that the hint is telling us that this distribution story is super important.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not possible to rationalize the data with a firm model that has the heterogeneity. I'm not saying I'm just saying that maybe it's not necessary. So one of the things that I didn't say is that you can think of a more kind of macro approach in sort of backing out these wedges along the development path for different countries and getting data on policies that actually were implemented in different countries, and kind of see if there's, if that sort of corresponds to sort of the reality, and sort of correlate the policies that different countries implemented at different moments in time with the wedges that you would sort of recover, and then sort of with that kind of argue that the timing of the policies, is sort of enough to understand what's going on. But yeah, I mean, this is obviously just a discussion about different ideas. I think all of these are feasible.
Thank you.
I had a little bit related comment that this is a session on Latin America, so maybe that's going to be strange, but there was a lot of concentration of firms in the late 19th century manufacturing sector in the US, and so this notion that there were limited wedges there were monopolists and they were clearly competing, and, with pretty substantial markups. So I'm wondering if there's not something there also, given that if you're a late adopter, a late industrializer, you won't be able necessarily to do this unless you're protected by state policies. So that was a question I had.
So as Federico said, it would be nice if this data could be extended going back, but what you said actually is related to our thinking. And Federico did show that the divorce doesn't mean that there's always this huge gap. I was noting your scale. Your gap is not as big as it is in Latin America. So in Europe, we see the gap as well. So, but they tend to move closer. So perhaps I misspoke. It's not that the gap is zero, but the gap is smaller. And as you said, the industrialization, the hardcore industrialization in the US did happen when they had the big firms. That is actually also the story in Japan. Japan is an industrialization via big firms as well. And so that's why we do think that this matters. In HBS, they always mention Chandler, the visible hand, and it's the hand of the firms. So that's why we think it matters. But we may be wrong. Once we do it and we do the horse race, maybe the wedge is more important than the other one. We also do think that the firm data is going to allow us perhaps to disentangle, is it really labor being more expensive? Is it capital being more expensive? Is that they're not adopting the technology? Perhaps it's going to allow us to sort a little bit of all of those things. One interesting thing about Latin America is, at least the beginning, we blocked trade. We didn't allow them to come in different ways. Even Costa Rica thought we could do cars, just to give you a sense of delusion. So I don't think per se straight, but yes, we need to be agnostic. And once we get the data, allow the data to tell us a little bit more. I don't know if Martí, who's in the middle of the night there, wants to say something, or just go back to sleep the way God intended.
Okay, I can say something. So first, thank Federico for this great discussion with the very little that we gave him. So I would say, just building on what Laura is saying, so another thing that, and I think it connects to one of the last points that Federico made, that so one very exciting thing that at least I find very exciting about using this micro level data is, for example, we can estimate productivity at the firm level and then separate that from other types of distortions, market power, and see how this has evolved over 70 years, right? And so this is something that obviously it's not possible to do with an aggregate production function, and I think it can really shed light into different type of policies that have been implemented and so on. Which I find this is something that at least excites me very much about this project.
Yeah, agree, totally agree.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions to any of the papers that we heard?
Again, infinity and beyond. Thanks to Federico, because he really was extrapolating from what we said. So he gave us very good ideas.
So if there's no more comments, I'd like to thank everybody. I think that we had a session that was quite interesting, thinking about this future of work in a different context than what is often discussed. And we hope to be able to carry on this discussion later in more of this research, as more of this research is being put out. So thank you very much for all for participating, and stay healthy and safe as we go along.
Thank you.